So we've got the new piece lined up with the stuff on our pattern. It's in the right position. So then we open this up and we're ready to sew. So we are going to be sewing exactly on the line between sections 1 and 2 in order to add our piece number 2. But where do we start and where do we end? So this is the seam allowance out here for the block itself. Because piece number 1 and piece number 2 are adjacent to that outer seam allowance, we need to make sure that our stitching line extends all the way through the seam allowance. So the fold goes completely across the piece of paper. So I can see where the fold is out here beyond the seam allowance. I'm actually going to start right in the fold, a little bit outside of the seam allowance. And I'm going to stitch along the fold line into the seam allowance, and then I'm going to back tack a little bit across the seam allowance line, and then proceed forward and stitch all the way along the line between number 1 and number 2, all the way along the line. And when I get to here, that is where piece number 4 is going to get sewn on. But again, if we think about the seam allowance from piece number 1 and piece number 2 that are going to get attached to piece number 4, that comes out to here. So I want to stitch slightly more than 1/4 inch beyond this point here to make sure that I've crossed where that seam allowance is. And then I do a little back tack and come back here and stop. So beyond the seam allowance on both sides of the line, that's where you need to do your stitching.